This regular geometric shape is known throughout the world, a giant pentagon surrounded by asphalt parking lots and multi-level interchanges, a symbol of absolute military power, frozen in limestone and concrete. Visually, this building conveys the idea of invulnerability, control, and cold mathematical logic. But the flawless geometry is deceptive.
Behind the monolithic facades lies a history of the continuous struggle of matter with functions it is unable to withstand.
It is a chronicle of constant physical strain, internal decay, and forced transformations. By the end of this story, it will become clear how a temporary administrative solution turned into the heaviest land fortress on the planet. The true cost of each technological upgrade will be revealed, as well as the reason why the ideal architectural form became the main trap for its creators. But to understand the scale of the mistake, we must return to the starting point.
To the moment when there was only raw earth, landfills, and infrastructural chaos where the concrete rings now stand.
By the summer of 1941, the U.S. Army's management structure was in a state of physical disarray. The War Department had grown to unprecedented proportions and was chaotically scattered across 17 different buildings in Washington. Coordination between separate headquarters required couriers to physically transport documents across the congested city. The system wasted critical time on the logistics of paper and people. The threat of entering World War II required a radical consolidation of the command structure. There was a need for a single space capable of accommodating 40,000 people at a time. No existing project in the world envisaged concentrating such a mass of employees under one roof. The idea seemed insane from an engineering and sanitation standpoint. Engineers had to artificially change the topography of the area. Tons of earth were moved to create an artificial elevation capable of protecting the future building from flooding. To stabilize the foundation, more than 41,000 concrete piles were driven into the unstable ground.
The pile driving process turned the area into a zone of continuous industrial noise and vibration.
The ground shook for days on end as heavy steam hammers pounded through the silt to solid bedrock. At this stage, the project had already begun to consume resources on a scale comparable to the needs of a small country. The work was carried out under extreme time constraints. The foundation was designed and poured simultaneously, with architects handing drawings to builders straight from their drafting tables. The cost of mistakes increased with every ton of concrete poured, as there was no turning back. The surrounding infrastructure resisted the appearance of the giant. Old roads had to be ruthlessly demolished, redrawing the map of communications for the entire district.
The building did not yet have walls, but it had already begun to deform the space around it, subordinating the region's logistics to its needs.
The very idea of bringing all military command together in one place met with resistance. Critics pointed to the obvious danger of creating a single target for a potential airstrike, but the logic of administrative efficiency outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. Thus, in the swamps of Virginia, the process of creating a structure that was originally conceived as a temporary solution for the war period began. None of the initiators of the construction imagined that this concrete monster would outlive its time and become a permanent symbol of the era. The shape of a regular pentagon was not the result of a brilliant architectural insight or occult symbolism. It was a direct consequence of the severe limitations of physical space. The originally selected site was bounded by 5 intersecting roads. The architects had to fit the design into an asymmetrical road polygon. When President Roosevelt ordered the construction site to be moved slightly downstream so as not to spoil the view of Arlington Cemetery, the shape had already been approved.
The engineers decided not to waste time redesigning and simply made the Pentagon symmetrical.
Thus, a random obstacle became a monumental standard. The concept of the building broke with conventional ideas about office construction. Instead of growing upward, the project began to spread out. The height was strictly limited to 5 floors so as not to disrupt the visual panorama of Washington and to save the scarce steel needed to build high-rise elevator shafts. The internal structure consisted of 5 concentric rings, designated by the letters A through E. These rings were connected by 10 radial corridors, radiating from the central courtyard like spokes on a wheel. This web provided unprecedented speed of movement. It was possible to walk from any point in the building to any other in a maximum of 7 minutes. But this logistical efficiency had a downside. The geometry of the building created a disorienting labyrinth, devoid of natural visual landmarks.
Identical endless corridors with beveled corners turned movement within the complex into a mechanical process that suppressed the human psyche.
The 5-acre central courtyard became the core of the system. It was conceived as a ventilation and natural lighting zone for the inner rings. However, physically, it turned out to be the bottom of a giant concrete well, accumulating the heat and humidity of the Washington summer. The exterior facade was designed in a strict, almost utilitarian neoclassical style. It was clad in Indian limestone, creating the illusion of a monumental stone structure. But beneath this delicate aesthetic shell lay a brutal industrial framework. The project was completed on paper in a matter of weeks. The architects worked themselves to exhaustion, coming up with solutions that in peacetime would have taken years to discuss. The geometry of compromise was ready to be materialized in concrete. Construction began on September 11, 1941, and became the largest and fastest construction project in human history. The contractors were tasked with squeezing decades of work into a matter of months. To achieve this goal, 15,000 workers were brought to the site, working in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The main engineering problem was the shortage of structural steel. The country was preparing for war, and all the metal was being used to build ships and tanks. The project was radically revised in favor of reinforced concrete. The building was literally sculpted from sand, gravel, and cement extracted from a nearby river. The rejection of steel required a change in internal logistics. Without powerful load-bearing beams, heavy freight elevators had to be abandoned. Instead, wide concrete ramps were built between floors.
This archaic solution from the era of Roman stadiums proved to be ingenious in its simplicity, allowing huge masses of people and cargo to be moved without consuming electricity.
To supply the construction site with materials, a concrete plant was built right on the banks of the Potomac. Barges continuously delivered river sand, which was immediately turned into hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of mortar. The complex consumed raw materials at a rate unattainable by any commercial project of the time. The pace of concrete pouring outpaced the process of foundation settlement. Engineers consciously took a risk by erecting new floors on a foundation that was not yet fully stabilized. This decision laid the groundwork for a time bomb. Uneven settlement of the building became a chronic problem for decades to come. Working conditions on the site were extreme. In winter, workers lit fires inside the sections under construction to prevent the concrete from freezing before it hardened. In summer, the concrete bowl turned into a hot oven.
The injury rate was high, but the construction machine did not stop for a minute.
This synchronization of chaos required iron discipline. Trucks carrying construction debris drove millimeters away from vehicles delivering office furniture. Dust, the roar of jackhammers, and the smell of wet concrete became the natural working environment for the ministry's first 1,000 employees. By January 1943, just 16 months after work began, the giant was physically ready. The builders erected a structure larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, using wartime technology and human muscle power. From the moment it opened, the complex faced a severe stress test. The military bureaucracy began to fill the space at an alarming rate. Instead of the estimated 30,000 people, the building's population quickly exceeded 40,000. The geometry of the rings began to suffocate under the human mass. Moving along the ramps during rush hour resembled an organized evacuation. Streams of people moved in a solid wall, creating a colossal physical load on the floors and staircases. The air in the corridors quickly became stale due to a lack of oxygen and the inefficiency of the early ventilation systems. Open workspaces, designed to save space, turned into zones of acoustic terror. The hum of thousands of typewriters, ringing phones, and conversations merged into a continuous industrial noise. The lack of partitions made it impossible to isolate sound, turning each floor into a buzzing beehive. The temperature inside the building was a challenge in itself. In winter, the inner courtyards cooled down, and the cold penetrated through the thin single-pane windows. In summer, the massive concrete walls heated up, and the complex began to radiate heat inside. The air conditioning system, advanced for its time, could not cope with the volume. The life support infrastructure was working at its limit. Thousands of toilets, sinks, and pipes experienced peak loads twice a day. The built-in pneumatic mail system, consisting of miles of brass pipes, was constantly clogged due to exceeding the limits for sending capsules with documents. The enormous population density required the creation of an autonomous service system. Hospitals, banks, dry cleaners, and canteens opened inside the building. The complex became self-contained, no longer needing the outside world. It functioned as an isolated city with its own laws of physics and logistics. Disorientation in space became a mass phenomenon. Identical doors and endless windowless corridors in the inner rings caused couriers to get lost for hours on end. A complex system of color coding and numbering had to be introduced for navigation, but the labyrinth continued to swallow people up. The security service faced the impossible task of controlling such a hive of activity. Checking passes at the entrances created bottlenecks, and it was physically impossible to track the movements of employees inside the rings. The building was too large for effective visual monitoring. By the end of World War II, it was clear that the building had withstood the test, but at a high price. It had fulfilled its function by keeping the war management apparatus inside, but its internal resources had been severely depleted by the initial rush. The end of World War II did not bring relief to the complex. The transition to the Cold War radically changed the status of the building. From a temporary headquarters, it became the permanent nerve center of global confrontation. The physical space began to adapt to the realities of the nuclear age. The geometry of the Pentagon was now seen not as an architectural feature, but as a giant target. In the minds of military strategists, the building became the epicenter, the ideal point for delivering the first disarming blow to the enemy. This paranoia began to materialize in architectural solutions. Fortified bunkers and command centers began to be built under the building. Rooms with maps and communication equipment were sunk deeper into the ground, away from the thin roof. The building began to take root in the Arlington clay, creating a multi-level underground labyrinth hidden from prying eyes. The inner courtyard, once conceived as a recreation area, was given a grim, unofficial name. The cafeteria, located in the very center of the Pentagon, became known as the Ground Zero Cafe. The military cynically assumed that this wooden structure was the target of Soviet intercontinental missiles. The technological saturation of the complex took on the character of an avalanche. The advent of the computer age required huge spaces with a special climate. To install the first mainframes, it was necessary to reinforce the floors and drill new ventilation shafts to remove the enormous heat generated by the electronics. The cable infrastructure turned into an unmanageable jungle. Kilometers of classified communication lines were laid in old mines, ventilation ducts, and under raised floors. The building became overgrown with copper and optical nerves, increasing the weight of the structure and the risk of short circuits. The outer perimeter also began to change. The carefree attitude of the 1940s, when anyone could approach the facade, was a thing of the past. The first fences, patrols, and exclusion zones appeared. The building began to distance itself from the city, turning into a restricted facility. By the end of the 1980s, the complex was a paradoxical system. Outwardly, it remained the same symbol of stability, but inside it was overflowing with equipment, overloaded with secrecy, and technologically overheated. The old concrete body no longer corresponded to the scale of the task. In the 1990s, the building faced its main internal enemy: time and material wear and tear. Hidden behind layers of paint and suspended ceilings, the infrastructure arteries had reached the end of their service life. The complex began to rot from the inside, showing signs of systemic physical failure. The concrete, poured in haste in 1941, began to show the effects of using unpurified river sand and high humidity. Internal corrosion processes affected the hidden reinforcement where it was used. The basements were flooded due to the destruction of the waterproofing and constant breaks in the old cast iron pipes. Asbestos became the main hidden threat. Tons of this material were used in construction for pipe insulation and fire protection of floors. Half a century later, asbestos began to crumble, turning into deadly dust circulating in the complex's closed ventilation system. Tap water became undrinkable due to lead pipes and accumulated rust. Sewer collectors, not designed for modern discharge volumes, regularly overflowed, filling the lower floors with the smell of dampness and sewage. The sanitary condition of the once advanced complex had fallen to a critical level. The walls were covered with dozens of layers of paint, many of which contained dangerous concentrations of lead. Attempts to drill a hole for a new cable caused toxic plaster to crumble. The building had become an ecological trap for its own inhabitants. Temperature anomalies became unbearable. While on one side of the ring, employees sat in winter coats due to the aggressive operation of old air conditioners, on the other side of the building, people were suffocating from the stuffiness. It was technically impossible to set a uniform climate in a monolithic concrete structure. Single-pane windows not only let in the cold, but also posed a security threat. They vibrated easily from sound waves, making it possible to eavesdrop on conversations remotely, and posed no barrier to a blast wave in the event of a terrorist attack. An inspection of the structures revealed a frightening picture. The building did not comply with any modern building or fire codes. The lack of modern fire extinguishing systems, narrow evacuation staircases, and long dead-end corridors made the complex a potential mass grave in the event of a major fire. It became clear that cosmetic repairs were no longer enough to keep the building alive. The system needed radical surgery, otherwise it would just fall apart under its own weight and the pressure of worn-out utilities. The realization of inevitable collapse led to the launch of Project Phoenix, the most ambitious and complex reconstruction in the history of American architecture. The plan was to completely gut the building, leaving only the outer stone facade and the load-bearing concrete frame, and then rebuild it from scratch. The difficulty lay in the fact that the complex could not be shut down for a single second. Operational control over the armed forces had to continue uninterrupted. Therefore, the reconstruction was divided into 5 stages, cutting off and modernizing one wedge of the building at a time, while the other 4 continued to function. The first sector, known as Wedge 1, was sealed off with airtight partitions. Inside, the process of ruthless demolition began. Workers in chemical protection suits removed thousands of tons of radioactive slag, asbestos, lead paint, and rotten wiring. The building was stripped down to its bare concrete state from 1941. New engineering solutions were aimed at transforming the office space into a modern fortress. The main priority was resistance to external explosions. Ordinary windows were replaced with massive blocks of ballistic glass, almost 5 centimeters thick, each weighing more than a ton. Powerful steel I-beams were installed between the old concrete columns, forming a continuous load-bearing frame. This steel web was designed to prevent the floors from collapsing in a chain reaction in the event of local destruction of one of the load-bearing supports. The building was given an exoskeleton hidden inside the walls. To protect against shrapnel in the event of an attack, the walls were reinforced with Kevlar fabric. The same material used in bulletproof vests now covered the offices. This was an open admission that the building was no longer an administrative facility, but was considered a potential combat zone. The communication system was completely rebuilt. Instead of chaotic bundles under the ceiling, cables were laid in specialized trays, divided into levels of secrecy. The ventilation systems were equipped with powerful filters capable of blocking chemical and biological agents, turning each sector into an isolated capsule. A new fire extinguishing system covered all floors with a dense network of sprinklers, and evacuation routes were widened and equipped with autonomous lighting. Wedge 1 was becoming the most technologically advanced and secure structure in the country. The cost of this modernization was astronomical. The renovation budget exceeded the original cost of the entire construction in the 1940s many times over. Saving the building turned out to be more expensive than building a new one from scratch on an empty lot. By September 2001, work on CLIN 1 was almost complete. New offices began to fill with employees. The modernized sector stood as a shining example of engineering triumph, ready to challenge any theoretical threats of the new century. No one knew that a practical test of its strength would take place in just a few days. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the engineers' theoretical calculations collided with kinetic reality. A passenger airliner, turned into an 80-ton guided missile, struck the west facade at a speed of over 800 kilometers per hour. The impact occurred precisely at the joint between the recently reinforced Wedge 1 and the old Wedge 2. The physics of the collision were devastating. The fuselage smashed through the limestone exterior, passed through Ring E, smashed through Ring D, and came to rest in Ring C. Tons of jet fuel ignited, creating a fireball whose temperature instantly melted aluminum and began to burn through the interior of the building. But at this critical moment, the new infrastructure installed during the renovation began to work. The ballistic windows of the outer perimeter withstood the incredible pressure of the blast wave, preventing the fire from escaping and protecting employees in neighboring offices from deadly glass shards. The steel exoskeleton embedded in the old concrete fulfilled its main task. It redistributed the enormous weight of the destroyed floors to the surviving supports. The fatally wounded section of the building hung in the air, refusing to fall. This pause lasted 35 minutes. These minutes became the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. The delayed collapse allowed employees on the upper floors to descend the new expanded evacuation staircases. If the impact had hit the unmodernized sector, the fragile concrete of the 1940s would have collapsed instantly, like a house of cards. The consequences of that day forever changed attitudes toward the security of the facility. It turned out that even the most powerful armor could not completely protect against a kinetic impact of such force. The illusion of absolute physical invulnerability was shattered along with the limestone blocks. It became clear that fortifying the walls alone was not enough. A radical transformation of the space around the building itself was necessary, creating a distance capable of neutralizing any threat before it touched the concrete. After September 11th, the process of transforming the complex into a full-fledged fortress went beyond the facades. The vulnerability became obvious. The building was too close to public infrastructure. Physical distance was recognized as the main and most reliable line of defense. The highway, which ran dangerously close to the west facade, was permanently closed to public transport and physically moved further away from the walls. Earthworks changed the landscape, creating new barriers of soil and reinforced concrete. The building began to aggressively expand the exclusion zone around itself. Visual contact was limited. The perimeter was overgrown with multi-level barrier systems. Steel bollards capable of stopping a speeding truck rose from the asphalt around the entire ring. The space, once conceived as an open lawn, was bristling with hidden sensors and high-resolution cameras. The entire supply logistics had been radically revised. Trucks were no longer allowed to approach the building itself. A giant remote delivery terminal had been built at a safe distance. Now every box, every parcel was X-rayed, chemically analyzed, and transferred to internal, sterile transport. The militarization of space also affected the air environment. Camouflaged anti-aircraft defense positions appeared on the roofs of neighboring high-rise buildings and at strategic points around the perimeter. The airspace above the complex was closed permanently, turning the sky into an invisible restricted zone. Underground communications were further reinforced and expanded. New bunkers and tunnels for emergency evacuation appeared, extending far beyond the main ring. The building continued its downward movement, hiding the most critical nodes deep underground, beyond the reach of kinetic weapons. Each new threat in the world was instantly reflected in the appearance of new barriers around the Pentagon. The building turned into a sponge, absorbing global paranoia and expressing it through an increase in the thickness of the walls and the number of security perimeters. The price of this absolute security proved to be high. The fortress protected its walls but lost its original effectiveness as a place of work for tens of thousands of people. Isolation made processes slower, more complex, and more cumbersome. The current state of the complex is the apotheosis of paradox. Having completed a complete reconstruction of all 5 wedges, engineers have created the most secure administrative building on the planet. But this security has come into conflict with the demands of the digital age. Fortified matter began to lose out to information flows. Physical walls capable of withstanding an explosion proved powerless against cyber threats. The main battles now take place not on the approaches to the facade, but deep inside the server rooms. And here the old geometry once again becomes an obstacle. Thousands of servers, cryptographic machines, and data storage systems generate enormous amounts of heat. The enclosed spaces of the inner rings struggle to dissipate this thermal energy. Air conditioning units operate at the limits of their physical capabilities, turning basements into humming turbine halls. Digital architecture requires new cable routes, ultra-fast optical lines, and backup power sources. But the physical volume inside the exoskeleton is limited. Engineers are forced to fight constantly for every cubic centimeter of space in the ceiling niches. The complex's energy consumption has reached the level of a small industrial city. Powerful backup generators, hidden underground, are ready to take over at a moment's notice. The building lives in a state of constant tension, ready for instant disconnection from the external power grid. The problem of radioelectronic shielding has become critical. To protect against data interception, entire sectors have been turned into Faraday cages. Mobile phones do not work in these areas, and there is no access to external networks. Employees work in information isolators, cut off from the digital world. The fatigue of the concrete has not disappeared. Despite the steel frame, the original concrete poured in the 1940s continues to age. Stress sensors built into the walls monitor microscopic shifts in the foundation and vibrations around the clock. The body of the building is under constant medical supervision. The complex exists in a state of maximum saturation. It cannot grow upward, cannot expand outward, and has already reached its limit of depth into the ground. It is a closed thermodynamic system that sustains its existence through enormous injections of energy and resources. This geometry has long ceased to be just a drawing. 5 concrete rings enclosed around a red-hot core demonstrate how form attempts to subjugate content. Nothing remains of the original design of a temporary office building for clerks except for its external dimensions and limestone cladding. Behind the facade lies a multi-layered mechanism for survival. Every historical crisis, every technological leap, and every fear has left its physical mark on this space in the form of asbestos, steel, bulletproof glass, and new security perimeters. Power and paranoia have proven to be the heaviest building materials. The perfect Pentagon on radar screens and satellite images continues to convey unwavering stability. But inside this stone sarcophagus, an endless struggle with physical limits continues. The fortress stands not because it is invulnerable, but because the system refuses to acknowledge the weight of its own bulk.